Now, speaking of Artemis, what does 1 Timothy 2 look like if we read it in Ephesus in the shadow of the Artemisian, in light of this goddess, this well-known goddess Artemis of the Ephesians? Now, recently, just a couple of months ago, I had the pleasure of going to Turkey, going to Ephesus and seeing, all of the archaeological remains, seeing the, ruins of various temples, the great amphitheater, the library of Celsus. It was amazing, and obviously what dominates much of Ephesus was the worship of the goddess Artemis. Now, I got myself a little statue in the gift shop there, paid an exuberant amount of money. I mean, seriously, the wealth of Croesus probably was needed to do this. And and if you look at the statue, you can see all these sort of like bauble objects on there, and scholars debate what they are. Are they breasts? Well, I mean, one of the earliest interpretations we get from Tertullian suggests that they are, but there's no nipples or areolas. Maybe they're eggs, maybe they're bull's testicles, maybe they're gift bags, maybe they're magic bags. There's all sorts of things. And in terms of what those baubles are, well, to quote Nate Bargatze, impersonating George Washington, nobody knows. I feel like we should know, and yet we do not. Anyway, in some ways, Artemis was a mysterious goddess. But what does Paul's argument that he lays out in 1 Timothy 2 look like if you were living in first century Artemis, where the religious landscape is polytheistic, it's pagan, but it's dominated by the cult of Artemis, okay? And here I need to give some props, first of all, to my own doctorvater, Rick Strelin, who wrote the book Paul, Artemis, and the Ephesians. That was, my entree into this discussion about Artemis and her relevance to Paul's ministry. There's, of course, the book by Sandra Glan, Nobody's Mother, which I love. You should get that book. It is brilliant. It goes through the primary sources. I really do recommend that book. There's also Gary Hoag's book, Wealth in Ancient Ephesus, and the First Letter to Timothy, and Marge Mosco's blog that's filled with great information as well. And here's what I find on complementarian readings of 1 Timothy 2. They want to completely disengage it from the context in Ephesus, or just make it so it applies to anywhere and everywhere in the Greco-Roman world. So it doesn't have a precise or a scandalous particularity. I mean, it's just stuff that's generally true anywhere and everywhere. It has a timeless quality to it. For instance, Tom Schreiner, Tom, the Prince of Exegetes Schreiner. I mean, Tom Schreiner is so great, they should build shrines to him at Southern Seminary and take relics of him there. I mean, Tom Schreiner is great, but Tom says this. He says, there is no clear evidence in Paul's letters that the Artemis cult played a role. Paul does not mention the cult, nor is there any specific notion in the text that shows the influence of the cult. And Mike Winger spends 90 minutes trying to explain why the Artemis cult does not matter for understanding 1 Timothy 2. In fact, he says it is demonstrably wrong to read the Artemis cult in 1 Timothy 2. That makes no sense to me for a variety of reasons. First, read Acts 19. That's about Paul's ministry in Ephesus. And the cult of Artemis was a big deal. It affected the events of Paul's ministry in Ephesus. There was a mob in Ephesus that wanted to lynch Paul because he was destroying the businesses of people who made idols of the goddess. People who accused Paul of dishonoring the great goddess Artemis. So yeah, the Artemis cult did affect Paul's ministry in Ephesus. And even Winger admits that Ephesus was like the Vatican or Mecca of Artemis. And he actually gives it a fairly good exposition of its significance for Ephesus. But then he says it's got no significance or meaning or application for understanding 1 Timothy 2. That part of his argument just kind of baffles me. Second, look, you cannot interpret Paul's letters in a vacuum or flatten out the distinctives of the Ephesian context by saying, look, Ephesians was, or his letter to someone in Ephesus, was just saying the sort of stuff you'd say anywhere in Greco-Roman society. Ephesus, Corinth, Athens, Assos, Athens, it's all the same. It's all the same. No, it's not. Well, there's some things that might be true everywhere. Nowhere is like everywhere. Each place has its own atmosphere and complexities. I know this because I've been to America. I mean, people like to generalize about Americans, like, all Americans are X. Well, we all know what all American Christians are like. All people in America are basically the same. Well, they're not. I mean, the religious ambience of Massachusetts, Massachusetts is heaven for people who don't believe in heaven, is very different from the religious atmosphere of Texas, where Jesus has his own line of AR-15s at Walmart. That kind of a thing. Nowhere is like everywhere. Okay, so Ephesus can have its own special things, its own themes, its own motives, its own specific ambience and atmosphere. I would also point out that Michael Immendorfer has written a whole thesis on the Artemis cult as the background to the letter to the Ephesians. And his book is called Ephesus and Artemis, the Cult of the Great Goddess, and Ephesus as the Epistle's Context. Now, Immendorfer finds a massive amount of similarities in the language of Paul's letter to the Ephesians and inscriptions and coins in Ephesus about Artemis. He also notes the relationship of Artemis to mysteries and magic, again, very relevant for understanding Ephesians. And Immendorfer thinks Ephesians may have been written for converts from the Artemis cult. If Immendorfer is even partially right, then why not think that Artemis provides the background not only to Ephesians, but to 1 Timothy, which is addressed to Timothy in Ephesus? Okay, and let me say too, and this is important, situating this passage in relation to the Artemis cult is not the attempt to undo what Paul plainly says. It's not the case of, Paul says, I do not permit a woman to teach or hold authority, and then I'm playing my Artemis card, which kind of nullifies everything you said. It's not like a game of Uno where you lay down that card and then you kind of reverse the order. Or it's not like I'm saying the power of Artemis compels you or something absurd like that. I'm not claiming that appealing to the Artemis cult is a way of negating the fact that Paul is making a prohibition about women teaching and having authority. I mean, this reference, this need to get into the background, it's not, as Winger says, a secret gnosis about historical knowledge of the past. Neither is it a fabricated history, as he alleges. That's his words, by the way. The connection to Artemis does not change the fact that Paul does make a prohibition about a woman teaching a man, however we understand that, whether that's universal or it's more general, whether it's husbands or wives. A real prohibition about women teaching something and having some kind of authority is made. A real restriction is made on these women with argumentation to back it up, rooted in Genesis and talking about things that are powerful and meaningful, and this prohibition was urgent at the important. I'm not denying that. Rather, the egalitarian point is that correctly grasping the socio-religious context of Ephesus, dominated as it was by the Artemis cult, explains the prohibition about a woman teaching in its precise context. It also accounts for the departure of this from the rest of Paul's letters. Paul nowhere else makes this prohibition, and it ensures that we do not apply the prohibition in ways for which it was not intended, which is to say that the where and the why is important for understanding how we apply it today. Okay, I'm not trying to use historical background to get around the prohibition that Paul says. I'm trying to understand the prohibition of these women teaching and holding authority in the way it was intended, for the purposes it was intended, so we can apply it properly today. Now, against Winger and friends, I want to defend the relevance of the Artemis cult for understanding 1 Timothy 2, but this is where I do have to make an opening admission. Against many egalitarians, many egalitarian scholars, the Artemis cult was not a hyper-feminist cult. It was not a fertility religion. Artemis was not a divine mother. It was not a cult run by females only. It had men involved in it. They were called the Curetes, and Winger talks a lot about them. My doctorvater, Rick Strelin, he says this: the cult of Artemis was fundamentally a cult of the female for both male and female. In fact, Winger does a pretty good job of showing how inexact, sloppy, and sometimes careless egalitarian scholars can be in making gross generalizations and mischaracterizations about Artemis. And it's worse because some of them are my good friends. People have made assumptions, recycled the same footnotes without checking them, without going back to the primary sources. That said, women did play a prominent part in the Artemis cult, and Artemis was particularly popular with women because she was the goddess of midwifery, childbirth, and virginity. Jan Bremer, very important scholar in the study of ancient religion, the Greco-Roman world, Bremer observes that in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, there is more epigraphical testimonies regarding Artemis's priestesses than her priests. It seems likely that in the course of time, most male aristocrats shifted their interest to the imperial priesthoods, even though Artemis's priesthood must have long remained prestigious due to its venerable age and wealth. So, who is Artemis when she's not busy being a goddess or the subject of exegetical debates between Mike Bird and Mike Winger? Let me give you a brief bio of the Artemis cult. The cult of Artemis existed since at least the 4th century BC to the 3rd century AD, all the way through to the Persian, Greek, and Roman periods. In the Artemis myth, Artemis was the virgin daughter of Zeus and Leto. After seeing her mother Leto go through a painful 9 days of labor for her brother Apollo, she asked Zeus for permission to remain an eternal virgin and to roam about helping women in childbirth. That is why Artemis is associated with childbirth as well as midwifery, and women may have prayed something along the lines as, goddess, give me a good birth or a quick death. The city of Ephesus was the temple warden of the goddess Artemis. But over 50 cities in Asia Minor put images of Artemis on their coins. There were statues built to Artemis during the Hellenistic period. She was known as Artemis the Saviour in particular. She was identified with the Roman goddess Diana and the Egyptian goddess Isis, leading to kind of hybrid narratives and eclectic rites of devotion to her in various parts of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Artemision, the massive temple complex, was to Ephesus perhaps what Disneyland was to Anaheim and LA. The Artemision was one of the largest buildings in the Mediterranean world, even bigger than the Athenian Parthenon. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The Artemision was also the center of religious, social, economic, and political life in Ephesus. Artemis provided the sacred reality in which residents of the city lived, as the goddess was the patron and protector of the city, which is why it's very easy to whip a mob who could chant for 2 hours, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." There was normally a bi-weekly ceremonial procession from the temple into Ephesus. Artemis's birthday was celebrated on the 6th of May every year to celebrate the goddess's birth, and it was an act not just of piety but also of patriotism in Ephesus. By the 1st century, the Roman imperial officials had done everything they could to restore the revenues and rights to Artemis, even as they regulated worship of the goddess and integrated it into the official pantheon of religions, including the imperial cult. So the idea was there to make sure that the worship of Artemis was in sync with the religious policies of the wider empire, particularly when Augustus took over as the leading man of the empire. And that's why you can find something like a basilica in Ephesus dedicated to Artemis, Augustus, and Tiberius in the 1st century. So what does this mean for the Christians in Ephesus? Well, again, to quote Strelin, in the 1st century, Christians met a deity, Artemis, whose beneficent and protective power was experienced and appreciated by many in Ephesus, and whose temple, in its sheer beauty and grandeur, symbolized her presence. But how does the Artemis cult help us make sense of 1 Timothy 2, 8-15? Well, that's what I'm going to explain now. Well, if you look at verse 9 with its prohibition about women wearing elaborate hairstyle, gold, pearls, or expensive clothes, you'll see it's quite relevant. Now, there are exhortations against women wearing outlandish displays of wealth, apparel, and cosmetics in many biblical passages. I think certain places in Proverbs speak a lot about it. Also, there were the new Roman women who allegedly dressed more extravagantly, and they were somewhat incongruent in their social etiquette and behavior, which a lot of male Roman writers complain about. But the problem of overly decorative clothing and apparel was particularly acute in Ephesus, where participants of the cult habitually dressed in extravagant fashion. What is interesting is that if you read an ancient romance novel called Ephesians, set in Ephesus, written by Xenophon of Ephesus in the 1st century, it describes in detail what a procession in the temple of Artemis looks like. Now, Winger actually mentions this book, but he doesn't give the reading from the text. So let me give the reading for you. Okay, this is one of the opening scenes of the book. It says, a local festival for Artemis was underway, and from the city to her shrine, a distance of 7 stades, all the local girls had to march sumptuously adorned. And then we're told, heading the line of girls was Anthea, daughter of Megamedes and Equippe, locals. Anthea's beauty was marvelous and far surpassed the other girls. She was 14, her body was blooming with shapeliness, and the adornment of her dress enhanced her grace. Her hair was blonde, mostly loose, only little of it braided, and moving as the breezes took it. Her eyes were vivacious, bright like a beauty's, but forbidding like a chaste girl's. Her clothing was a belted purple tunic, knee-length and falling loose over the arms, and over it a fawn skin with a quiver attached, arrows, javelins in hand, dogs following behind. Often when seeing her at the shrine, the Ephesians worshipped her as Artemis. So also at the sight of her on this occasion, the crowd cheered. The opinions of the spectators were various. Some in their astonishment declaring that she was the goddess herself, or the goddess was someone else, or she was someone fashioned by the goddess. But all of them prayed, bowed down, and congratulated her parents. And the universal cry among the spectators was, Anthea the Beautiful. What this means is that Paul is not just calling for modest dress in verse 9, like you might find in the book of Proverbs. What he's saying are words to the effect that women shouldn't show off their ostentatious bling, their luscious, extravagant clothing. They should not dress like the priestesses and participants in the Artemis cult. I also want to add another story I came across. In the much later and apocryphal Acts of Paul, this is written in the 2nd century, and it's about Paul's ministry and some of the things that happened to him. In the Acts of Paul, Paul encounters an Ephesian woman named Artemilla. Artemilla, I think that's symbolic for Artemis. And Paul tells her, set aside your jewelry, finery, your fine clothing. Do not trust in beauty or riches, and instead put your hope in God, who gives freedom and forgives sins. Now, that story of Paul meeting an Ephesian woman called Artemilla and telling her effectively to repent of her love of fine jewelry and fashion and to find hope in Christ, you could call that perhaps a parable of the Christian response to women involved in the cult of Artemis. I think it's a very interesting story, and it's very illustrative of, I think, how important dress was for women in the cult of Artemis, and women would even try to look like the goddess herself. Now, Paul also says that about the women, they should make themselves attractive by doing good, which is appropriate for women who claim to honor God. In effect, you honor God the Father, not by fashion, but by faithful action, not by dress, but by good deeds. And again, that sounds very relevant to the women living in Ephesus.